Okay, so my name is Eric Kansa. I'm with Open Context, and the title's sort of aspirational, or maybe it's a lie. But what I want to talk about is not that you have enough on your plate in dealing with field data management, especially with mobile systems. Everything from connectivity, sun glare, heat, all that sort of stuff. But I also want to add on a little bit of extra complexity in thinking about what happens with your data after you leave the field, and the larger context of who's going to be using it in the larger community, not just people on your project, but other people who might be interested. And this includes our colleagues now, but also our colleagues in the future. So a lot of the discussion that I'm going to be talking about is this sort of relationship between the practice of field data management and the larger context of how this articulates with data as an issue in scholarly communications. And so that's the main point of my presentation. So I'm with Open Context. We're a publisher of archaeological data. And what I want to emphasize is that we're part of a decentralized ecosystem. The approaches that we take with Open Context are not necessarily the right approach for absolutely everybody. There are lots of complexities, lots of issues in field data management, in archaeological data management. There are lots of specialized systems that do things very well, that do things better than Open Context for certain kinds of applications. And that's totally fine. What I want to articulate is that this heterogeneity and diversity in the information systems that we're encountering as archaeologists is a good thing. All right, it's a feature. It's not a bug. And when we talk about things like interoperability, the ability to aggregate data, communicating across different kinds of systems, we're not necessarily talking about centralizing everything into one giant machine. That's not the point. The point is to work with lots of different things and choreograph a bunch of different data and services that are available to us. We happen to publish open data. It's mainly CC BY license, CC Creative Commons Attribution license. Again, that's not appropriate for absolutely everything, but it is an ethical choice in lots of circumstances. It's part of the reason why an ecosystem is an important kind of a thing. The data that we publish, we also version control with GitHub. That's a good solution for a lot of things. I could talk about that more. I'm not going to get into it too much today. And our source code is also on GitHub. The point is of some of that, both data and source code, the ways that we interact with data, the code is how we interface, interact, and understand data. These are really important to also consider as parts and parcels of scholarly communication. If we want our analyses and our interpretations to be understandable and the thought processes behind those to be understandable, then code is an important aspect of reproducibility just as much as data. One of the important aspects of this is that we also work with the California Digital Library. It's our institutional repository. There are other institutional repositories out there. Digital Antiquity has TDAR. There's the Archaeological Data Service. The German Archaeological Institute is working on a system called IANOS. So there are going to be lots of different repositories in this larger ecosystem. There already are. We happen to work with the CDL for a variety of institutional reasons and for some technical reasons. But again, this is a choice that is not the choice that's absolutely required for everybody. Further illustrating that an ecosystem is a good way to think about these kinds of things, because so long as we also consider how this ecosystem, the different parts of it, interface and interoperate with one another. Last is mention the German Archaeological Institute. So we're working now in partnership with them. They're offering us mirroring and backup and those types of supports, and we're going to be doing some more collaboration with them in the future on shared development. So this is, unfortunately, we're in a pretty rarefied room of a bunch of people who usually consider digital paperless to be important enough to at least talk about and maybe critique, but at least, or we're mostly practicing it. And this is a rarefied kind of a thing. This is not the sort of standard worldview of a lot of our colleagues in archaeology. A lot of our colleagues in archaeology are still very much oriented to sort of a publish or perish paradigm that's sort of solidified in the 19th and 20th century, not 21st century kinds of aspirations for how they think archaeology needs to be communicated to the wider kind of a world. So it's as if, you know, the past 30 years hasn't really happened for a lot of people. And this is an important kind of a problem because those kinds of expectations really lead to the sorts of issues, all sorts of kinds of dysfunctions that make it harder for us to do digital archaeology, to do field data management in a way that is more coherent and in a way that does make larger meaning and larger possibilities for wider communities. So this is a journal. This is actually the original journal. It's a 17th century mode of scholarly communication. And, you know, we think we're doing all sorts of cool digital, you know, you get this JSTOR and stuff like that. Paraphrasing Jason Priam, who's trying to reform a lot of scholarly communication, an electronic journal is basically just a paper journal that's delivered on a faster horse, right? So PDF has a lot of limitations, especially if you want to try to reuse other people's data. And that issue of reuse is where I want to talk about it. It also has a bit of drawbacks too, since a lot of this information that our colleagues are normatively publishing is really captured in a pretty oppressive kind of a commercial kind of a setting with really strict intellectual property laws, IP surveillance, and strict networking laws, and it's extremely expensive. So if we're worried about the sustainability of what we do, and that subject has come up a bit, we have to worry about the sustainability of the larger information ecosystem in archaeology. Normative publishing is definitely quite broken. This is already touching on one of the issues. If most of our main goals are to create that, you know, that PDF document that's going to be sitting on a JSTOR server or an Elsevier server, we're going to get into a lot of dysfunctions. All this effort, all this intellectual effort that's going into data management, organizing relational databases to really figure out good ways of recording the kinds of phenomena that we're encountering, that roadblock about that we don't actually have really good venues for communicating all of that, that's a big problem. That's going to be that, and it creates a sort of sense of ownership and hoarding that makes it difficult to be able to bring information together. As a result, when we talk about data in a larger sense, you have the data management plan, right? The National Science Foundation or the National Endowment for the Humanities often talking about thou shalt manage your data or you're not going to get a grant, right? So it's become an issue of compliance. And we talk about data, we often talk about data in terms of standards and in compliance and of management. This is itself probably part of a problem because what it does is it sort of communicates and it sort of says to some of our colleagues that data doesn't really have a lot of intellectual issues associated with it. There's not a lot of intellectual engagement, much wider in the discipline. And that's something that we really need to try to address. So, main point about all this, and this is what we're trying to do with Open Context, is to really communicate the idea data sharing is a form of publication. Data sharing requires intellectual investment if we want to make it go well. And data are for discovery and for inspiration. It's not just a management issue. This is something that we want to try to you know, explore, discover, do new things, engage with new communities. All of this is really an essential aspect of data. It's not just sort of, you know, complying with this or that kind of standard. Really briefly, for Open Context, because we're taking people's data sets that are contributed to us from the wider community, and we have a publishing workflow, that publishing workflow involves tools like OpenRefine, which is formerly called Google Refine, which is a tool that we use to help clean up tabular data. So there's this life cycle, or there's sort of stages where data go through, where it's created by a team of researchers. We work with them on creating necessary documentation. The review and editing part includes sort of copy editing, consistency, checking on identifiers. There's a lot of work that goes into all of this. And then there's also annotation and then subsequent publication, depositing into the University of California's archive, and also version control. Because when you work with data, you also notice that you're never going to clean up everything well the first time. You got to keep on, as you use data, you're going to encounter new problems with the data that you didn't notice before. Fixing all of these things requires continual cycles of version control, and ideally, that involves more and more people as you go along. So really briefly, this is just a screen grab of a record from Poggio Civitate, long-running excavation that's now directed by Anthony Tuck at UMass Amherst. And just to give you a little sense about what some of the stuff is that we've been publishing, this is a Bucaro vessel with some pictures on the bottom helping to describe it. It's got some context information. And when we publish, we're trying to link information like this with wider sets of resources that are available elsewhere on the web. Okay, so open context is not just to try to put something out there as like an online exhibit, but it's also to try to make it, the information articulate with a wider set of scholarly context that's related. So here, the type of Bucaro we've related to Arachne, which is a data system that's run by the German Archaeological Institute, and that is just there to help situate that concept of Bucaro with a wider set of universe of other discussions of Bucaro that are out there. Another thing that I want to articulate about that, Arachne has open APIs. We can draw in information from Arachne to display in open context. Open context also has APIs. Those APIs are actually really important because we create machine-readable representations of the data that can go into GitHub for version control, also go into the California Digital Library. These are done in open formats and open standards that have a longevity that should work well long into the future because they're well documented and they're widely used by lots of different researchers, not just in archaeology. And also not just researchers. These are open web standards. So just to give a little bit of an illustration about what some of the value is in all of this and how it could articulate back to with a lot of the questions that we've been exploring in this conference, I want to introduce just a small project that we did that was funded by NEH and actually the Encyclopedia of Life. They had a data challenge, and we got an award from them to do this. And this is a large-scale investigation of zooarchaeological data sets from several, about 15 epipaleolithic sites through chalcolithic sites in Anatolia. And this is sort of a kind of a first to try to bring together lots of different zooarchaeological data sets created by zooarchaeologists over mainly the past decade, actually. That's involved something like 300,000 bone specimen. The analysis itself chucked out about half of them because, you know, a lot of them are sort of unidentified shaft frag. These bone specimens represent something like, you know, 4 person years of zooarchaeological study. Okay, this is a huge amount of effort that goes into the creation of some of these data, and it's really important to sort of illustrate the huge amount of savings for the discipline of being able to reuse each other's data, to be able to see each other's data, to be able to reuse it. All that effort is no longer wasted. That information is now available for other people to be able to reuse, not just for this specific study. 34 different contributors, lots of different projects. A hat tip to the Çatalhöyük project, who had the most complicated ways of describing animal bones. It's up to 110 different descriptive properties for a single bone, which is applause, and really thorough documentation there. And everybody else had lots of different kinds of schema, okay, for describing their bones. Now, we actually got something out of it. The zooarchaeologists were able, through a workflow that I'll describe in a little bit more detail, to be able to come up with archaeologically interesting interpretations about the origins of farming, basically, the spread of animal herding from the Fertile Crescent over in towards Europe. And, you know, be able to generate a map with arrows on it, right? That's a big goal in archaeology. And we have that published in PLOS One. So in that and also PLOS One, interestingly enough, actually requires you, if you're going to publish in PLOS One, to share your data, which is really nice. So all the data sets that are available that are described in that particular publication are available. They have DOIs that we get through the California Digital Library to be able to provide stable identifiers to the different data sets that are involved. So archaeologically interesting interpretations, that's not the point of this talk. What I wanted to talk about more were this linking up these different data sets together and the issues that are involved in that. Now, zooarchaeology, I think, would be pretty trivial to be able to link together. And actually, certain kinds of attributes in the zooarchaeological data we could bring together with a high degree of confidence, where the zooarchaeologists who were looking at it, at these shared data, felt confident that we were able to reconcile the different terminologies and descriptions that came in these different data sets. So things like animal taxonomy, bone part, fusion in most cases, side of the animal, that sort of thing. There were other things that were a lot harder. And if you think about it, when you get into the weeds in something like zooarchaeology, especially when you're recording things like teeth, teeth are a real pain in the neck for zooarchaeologists who are often using Microsoft Excel. You know, Microsoft Excel is the most popular data management tool that most people have. So as we talk about wonderful tabular wonderfulness in relational databases or graph databases or whatever, baseline is most people are using Excel. Excel is crap for dealing with really complicated kinds of things. So you have more than one tooth, right, for the most part, if we're lucky. And the zooarchaeologists want to describe each and every one of them. A lot of that information, since they're using Excel, gets sort of lumped together in a pretty complicated kind of text field, all right? And that's fine if you are a zooarchaeologist working on your own assemblage and you only have to deal with a certain limited number of that kind of thing. But as you try to scale this out, as you try to bring multiple data sets together, the limitations in modeling that are inherent in using a tool like Excel become a really big problem. And so this is an important kind of point. As we move towards sharing data and sharing data with wider kinds of communities, then the modeling issues become so much more apparent and so much more critical. And that has to feed back then into the workflows. So for the zooarchaeologists at first, you know, nobody expected them to, they didn't expect to share their data or have anybody else see it. It's kind of like my desktop, right? And like, I don't want anybody in my office to see it because it's a total mess. But once you start making these things kind of public, then there is more of an incentive, especially if reuse becomes something that becomes more normative in our discipline, then the incentives start to kick in for actually engaging in the intellectual effort that's required in good data management, all right? So that doesn't mean, it doesn't matter if you're using like FileMaker or whatever, you know, these are sort of meta issues. The key point is we need the intellectual engagement and we need the reward systems in place to reward that intellectual engagement to do data well. Now, just to point things out, there's so much experimentation going on. A really interesting project around this that is thinking about issues of data organization, of what it is we should be recording, say in field data management. Giorgio Bucciolati was working at Tel Mozan or Kesh in Syria. And it's, the point about illustrating this slide is this is a project that is going about things in very, very different kinds of ways, but it's extremely thoughtful. The modeling effort that's going into this is not the same as the modeling effort that went into other archaeological projects. If we want to, when we start thinking about things like standards and stuff like that, we also have to consider that we don't want to prematurely standardize, right? We don't necessarily know how to do this well yet, especially when we're talking about complex excavation kinds of data. Just a little bit about linked data, why it's important in this. We use linked data. We use linked data for annotation over standardization in the sense that we accept people's own idiosyncratic ways of organizing information, describing information. We try to link it up with annotation to shared kinds of standards. Just to give you a really brief explanation, Seb will get into this a lot more, but essentially linked data is the use of stable web identifiers to identify concepts and other kinds of entities. The idea is that that URI, that web identifier there, you could dereference and you could find out information about that place, and you could use that as a sort of a database key to be able to bring together different data sets from multiple sources. So this is from Pleiades, Gazetteer. It's very important for a lot of our projects. This is what happens when you link a lot of data together. So this is a couple dozen projects, museum collections, et cetera, that are using Pleiades, and this has been aggregated by the Pelagios project. And you can get a heat map of the sort of scholarly web resources and how they're related to the Mediterranean world. We're creating I'm involved in a project called Periodo to create web identifiers for chronology, for period assertions, which is also a very important aspect of metadata to be able to relate data sets together. Key modeling aspect about this is that a period for us is going to be defined by, it's going to be, have a certain kind of geographic coverage, a certain chronological coverage, and it's going to be created by an authority. So that authority could be you if you don't like any of the other periods, or you could reuse the periods minted by another authority that you trust. We're also working on the DINA project, which is to create linked data for North American archaeology. This is with David G. Anderson and Josh Wells, funded by the NSF. And we're creating stable identifiers for American archaeological sites, mainly in the Southeast and the Midwest. And we're cross-referencing this with TDAR. And right now we're about 70% done. But this is actually the first bit of linked data now in North American archaeology, where we have the identifiers that represent site file data that are managed by site file managers, state government officials. And we're cross-referencing that with metadata in the TDAR repository. So you can see that you can bring together these different resources with linked data and allow a flourishing ecosystem. One part of that ecosystem is Andrew White, who is building a database of the Eastern Woodlands Household Archaeological Project. He's managing his own data. He's not putting it into open context, but he is cross-referencing his own data with these DINA identifiers so that his information about households in Eastern North America can be brought together with a key identifier that could eventually link his data with museum collections and all sorts of other things. So with that, I'm going to conclude with a nutshell of the main thing about this is that we need to think about the sort of larger world of scholarly communications, the reward systems, and the fact that all this wonderful intellectual investment that we're putting into our data needs to be rewarded. And the kinds of products that you're creating in terms of software and data need to be considered as first-class citizens in the world of archaeological scholarship. Thanks. So I'm out of time.